Yee! Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tiffany here, and I'm the owner of Tiffany Gordon Cosplay LLC, which is a company that focuses on costume and prop fabrication as well as education. And I'd love to have you as part of our cosplay building community, so like this video and subscribe to the channel. For today's cosplay tutorial, it's not really going to be a tutorial, it's going to be more of this is how I did it and what to not do for your version of Lilith's wings. Yeah, because these are my most complicated pair of wings I have made so far, and if you've been around for a while, you know I've made a lot of pair of wings. And I worked on these for a very long time, and I ran into a lot of issues. I did a lot of new things that I wanted to try, and I learned a lot. I'm happy for how they look, but I don't recommend making yours this way. So let us begin with showing you how I did my wings. To first start off, we gotta talk about the reference images that I used for Lilith. And there's a lot of reference images of Lilith, some official from their books and everything, some fan arts. You've got their small statue, and of course their really large statue that's at Blizzard and that was at BlizzCon. But the main one I used was this specific reference image, specifically for the shape of the wings. And I think I got pretty close to the shape that I wanted to mimic off of this reference image. And of course, if you want to make your own version of Lilith's wings, I do have my 2D blueprint that I used for making them available on my website, TiffanyGordonCosplay.com, link in the description of the video. And now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the bone structure. Now, bone structure is the most important thing besides a harness for your wings, so that way they are structurally sound. And for making them, I typically like doing my bone structures for wings using CPVC pipes and using all of their adapters, couplings, elbow joints, things like that to make my wings. I find this to be a really strong material for bone structures. And you can see here from the material list of everything that I used for this part, it was mostly that. Now, for the specific wing shapes, I did use two different sizes, 3/4 inch as well as 1/2 inch. Reason being is 1/2 is smaller, but they're not as strong, and 3/4 is larger, but it's also not as small. So you kind of have to go back and forth, and basically for the main connection joint of where I had it attached from my back to the main bend upward to where they all kind of finger out, that was 3/4 inch. And then all of the other small parts going into the body as well as to the spikes, I used 1/2 inch. And for all of the extra pieces, I used an elbow joint at the elbow. All of the top part pieces, I just used couplings, and I'll get to that reason why later. As well as I had to fly to BlizzCon with these wings, so that means the wings have to disassemble for transportation. And typically what I like to use is male and female adapters. These are specifically 1/2 inch, and they're just pieces with a threaded system, so you can screw the spikes on and off of the wings. And transportation for wings is always something to keep in mind, whether you have large wings or not, so that's kind of something to always think about before making any pair of wings, not just Lilith's. And here's kind of what one strand of the wing would be, where it was a base where the spike would be of 1/2 inch CPVC pipe, followed by the male and female adapters, and then another piece of 1/2 inch CPVC pipe going onto a coupling piece. And how I got all these pieces was basically I had my blueprint all printed out, and then I just kind of marked on the wings as well as onto my piping how long I wanted each piece with one color, as well as some of these pipes I do need to bend. So I marked these with another color of Sharpie to indicate where these bend marks would be. And then I just cut each of the pipes using a jeweler saw. I highly recommend you do like I did, and after 15 years, I finally bought a PVC cutter, and it's gonna be about the same price as a jeweler saw. So I used what I had, but now I have a PVC cutter, and it's so much faster. And yeah, so do that. And as I said, some pieces had to then be heat bend using a heat gun. I'll do another video later on how to do this, but there's a lot of safety things involved, just be aware. And then the last part was just to assemble all of the parts. And for this was for all of the adapters, elbow joints, the couplings. You basically want to rough up where they're going to attach with sandpaper. So this way your 2-part epoxy has something to grip onto. Apply your epoxy, put the pieces together, and wait for them to dry. And these are what all of the final pieces looked like for me. I will note that I did not attach all of the pieces at the top together. I highly recommend for if you are doing a different version of wings to have these where they attached with the pipes, as this will give it a stronger joint. But for my case, I did not, and you'll see later in the video how I did it. Now for these spikes, and these are the bottom parts of the wings, and this is attempt number 1. And let me just say that this attempt did not go to waste, as I still used it in attempt number 2. And this part was mainly 3D modeling and resin printing each of the parts, and you can see all the materials I used here. And basically, I took my reference images and made 2D basic shapes that went into 3D modeled shapes using my CAD program, Rhino 6. With this, I was basically able to create my block base shapes, and then I imported all of it into another sculpting program called Gnomon Sculpt, where I was able to really go to town and make these pieces look like the spikes and have all these details and things. And I'll also note that when I designed these, I already designed it with the intention that the CPVC pipe and half of the female-male adapter was going to fit inside of this piece once it was printed. So with that in mind, there's also kind of a negative hollow channel on the inside. And because of printer limitations and I'm resin printing, I did have to cut each of these spikes into 3 to 5 different separate pieces, so that way they would print on my resin printer. Once they were printed, I then started to assemble each of them onto the bottom of the CPVC pipe. I did make sure that all of the pieces were fully screwed together, because one thing I've learned over the years from doing just the male and female adapters is if it's not fully screwed together, the 2 male and female adapters, you just kind of randomly glued on whatever your piece was at the bottom, it won't align perfectly when you fully turn the 2 pieces together. So you always want to do this with them already attached. But basically I put all of the resin pieces on individually, applying super glue as a temporary tack to hold the pieces together, and then just resin welded the pieces together using resin and a UV flashlight. And the last part was to clean up all of the pieces to get rid of all of the printer lines as well as any misprint parts and stuff. And for this, just use a sanding buff. Don't use what I'm using. Yeah. I'll say I never took a picture of the final results because I knew after all of this, I didn't even have the wings frame fully finished. And each of these pieces, well, resin's a little bit fragile, so I knew there's a good chance these may break in transportation, as well as they were really heavy. Like, even though I printed them hollow and there is a hollow CPVC pipe on the inside, these things were heavy. Each wing was at least 10 pounds just for these stupid spikes. So don't resin print. So on to attempt 2, which there's still problems. And this method was using Smooth-On products and making molds and cast of the resin printed spikes, so they didn't go to waste. And here's everything that I used for this attempt. And for this method, like I said, we're gonna be taking our already made and cleaned up resin printed spikes, and we're gonna be making a mold out of them. Now, mold making, I've done a lot for casting metal pieces, but never really large pieces, much less I don't have any vacuum machines and everything. I was very limited with what type of mold making I could do for this process. And the method that I ended up using was actually Poyo Putty. And I did have help with this because it is definitely a 2-person project. And my husband basically would mix the Poyo Putty, the 2 halves, he would sit there and mix them together while I was using that small bit that he had given me to slowly wrap it around each of the spikes. And it is a fast process as the drying time time I think was like under either a minute or 3 minutes. So it was something where I couldn't mix and put it around the piece in time. So it was a good little team system for doing this, but basically covered the entire thing, leaving the top part exposed so that way I didn't have a mold of the inside of where the pipe would go. The downfall with this product is if it is not thick enough, the piece inside will actually show through. So you need to make sure there is at least 1/2 inch wall thickness around your entire piece with this putty, as well as you can't just lay the piece down. So I found using wax paper to wrap it afterwards was really good because it wouldn't cure to it and I could peel it off once it dried. Another issue with this product though is once you remove the piece from the inside, the actual mold that you made will collapse on itself. So you do need to add a hard shell around it. And I found that the easiest way for me was actually to use expanding foam. And I had a bunch of boxes laying around the house. I don't remember why, but I did. And I coated the inside of the box with more wax paper because the expanding foam does not stick to it. And then I inserted my pieces and I just put tons and tons of expanding foam and then put it closed and put some hard books on top of it, and then ended up waiting 24 hours. This process actually worked really well, and once it was fully dry, I just used a box cutter to cut it open all the way down and was able to remove the resin piece. Then I kind of had to make a makeshift wall with all of the pieces so I could pour them, because when you're making a cast, you need all of the material to go down and you can't really lay it sideways and have it dry correctly. So I just kind of taped everything to the wall and I made it so that way I would have a funnel that would be able to sit in another piece of cardboard and then insert into the piece. This was a whole complicated thing because you had to do this process and also make sure that your CPVC pipe piece also sat inside of it. So it's a whole balancing thing. It's kind of funny, but also I don't recommend this method. And for this casting material, I'm using Smooth-On's Feather Light. And I'll say that the material, when it's done and it's hardened, it's pretty light, but in reality, it was not that much lighter than the resin. So these part of the wings were still pretty heavy, and I ran out of time and I was kind of like, you know, this is what they're gonna be and I'm just gonna deal with it. So I wouldn't recommend this method either. I did, however, talk to the Smooth-On people later, and they did recommend a few other products to try instead, and they showed me some samples of like pieces that were actually really, really light, like light as paper. And I don't want to suggest that because I have not tried it yet, but in a future video I will be experimenting with that, and if it works I'll let you know. Now on to the harness. And I want to start off by saying the harness CAD file is not for sale, and I do not plan on having it for sale, as this harness is really complex and there's a lot of extra stuff with carbon fiber tubing and things like that that make it way too complicated. And so I plan on doing another version of a simple harness with simple attachments with PVC pipes so it can be much easier for anybody to use, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, here's everything that I used for making the harness. And the goal for harnesses is to support all of the heavy weight for your wings, as well as not have it bulky and stick out of your back and not cause you pain. So I went through about 3 different versions of this harness to make sure it was comfortable and actually would not be seen underneath my actual dress for Lilith. Now, there was a couple complications with that, but it still worked. And basically with my harness, I typically have it where it is a back plate and it doesn't have a lower back piece, but with this one, because of Lilith's low front, I had to actually make it where the waist strap was lower rather than underneath my breast. So it ended up having to have a second piece, but it actually was a lot more comfortable because it went with the curvature of my back and helped me stand up straight more. As well as for the last few years now, all of my wing harnesses, I have made it where the wings actually detach from the harness. This just makes it so much easier for going anywhere because the wings can come off really easily, like 1, 2, 3 pull, and they're off. And so this is the method I kind of do with all of them, where I have male and female parts that attach and interlock into each of them. And you can see the 2 top pieces are actually the pieces that will connect onto the harness back piece, and they have spots for the CPVC pipe to be permanently attached in each of them, so that way they have the structural support to hold it all together. And I know many of you are going to be like, oh, is there other options besides doing 3D printing and this and that? And yes, there are other options. However, I don't do those other options because they aren't strong and they do not support for a long period of time, especially for the amount of weight for these wings. So you can use the corset method where you make a U shape and insert it into a corset, but those are only going to work for really light weight for wings. So anything that is under like 2 pounds. So I can't really recommend other options with it being structurally sound. But for all my harnesses, I do use nylon strapping. I do find the thicker the strap, the less it hurts when wearing harnesses. And so I typically use 1-inch nylon strapping, and I like to use parachute buckles. Reason being is you can adjust both sides of that buckle rather than it be permanent, because some days you may want to pull that harness and make it a little bit tighter. Some days you might be a little bloated that day and you might want it to be a little bit looser, and I find that this is a really good method. And all you have to do with the nylon is cut it to the length that you want, heat treat the ends so that way it doesn't fray on you, and then I like to sew it a few times so that way it is really sound. And then you can just put your parachute buckles on and it is done. And for the harness, I did end up adding a little bit of upholstery foam on the inside so that way it wouldn't scratch me too much and would help support the weight. I ended up painting this part black because you could see them under the costume. And then this was actually my third version of the harness for my Lilith costume, just because I made the costume before I made the harness. And the harness ended up being too big and I couldn't put the costume around it. So I had to go through a few different variations. So that is this one. I typically do my harnesses as a backpack harness with my attachments here, the female attachments, and then I have separating parts that are male in the actual body of the wings so I can disassemble this and I don't have to wear the wings all day. If you are interested in a pair, let me know. I'm kind of considering making a base mock-up of just some generic harness for any type of costume wing. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Now for the body section of these wings. And this actually worked really well, and I highly recommend this method if you want a more lightweight pair of wings. And here's everything that I used for making them. And we're gonna call this method the expanding foam wings because that's what we're gonna be using. And basically, I just got some cardboard pieces and hot glued them into the shape that I wanted my wings to be. I then lined the piece with more wax paper as the expanding foam doesn't stick to the wax paper, inserted my piece, and then went to town with the expanding foam. Now, I will note that the expanding foam you choose will make a huge difference. I recommend getting the one that does 1-inch gaps, not the 3-inch gaps one, because the 1-inch one will be less bubbly when it dries, where the 3-inch one or anything that's larger than 1 inch ends up having a lot more air bubbles in the expanding foam. And when you go to carve this piece, you're going to hit these huge air bubbles that are like 2 to 3 inches big, and it kind of causes a problem when you're trying to sculpt the foam. But basically, when you fill the piece, you will want to put a lid on top of it, also lined with wax paper, and put weight, as the expanding foam is going to push this up and you want it to stay down so it'll only stay in your little cardboard box that you made. I will also note that when it dries after 24 hours, sometimes you will see there are wet spots, and I just ended up poking some holes with an X-Acto knife so that way it can continue breathing and dry more. But you will have to vary and see with the drying time, as temperature and your humidity will also affect how long it takes. Then I just started carving it into the shape that I wanted, into kind of like a rectangle, and then I started cutting the corners off until it was rounded. And you can kind of see here where those huge air bubble parts were when I used the 3-inch expanding foam. And then to cover them in 2-inch HD foam, heat treated it first, and then I cut it to the shape, applied contact cement glue to both the foam as well as the expanding foam, waited for it to dry, and then covered it together. And the plan for these wings is actually to cover them in foam clay so that way I can have a really cool skin-like texture onto the whole piece. If you haven't used foam clay before, it's really fun, but it does not really build up too well with thickness. So I always recommend, if you want one part to be thicker than others, add foam underneath it. So basically, where all of the spikes were going to attach to our body parts, I ended up adding strips of 10mm foam, as well as kind of a 10mm rectangle as a knuckle onto these parts. This would help for when I added the foam clay afterwards to have extra thickness there. Now remember at the beginning of the video when I said the ends of these were all going to have a coupling at the top and I wasn't actually connecting them with pipes? Well, the method that I ended up using was actually Worbla, and this is a thermoplastic for when it is cold, it's actually hard, and when you use a heat gun to heat it up, it will go soft and you can move it around, and then when it cools again, it will harden into that shape and become really hard. And so I basically did this for each of the 4 legs of the wings, and this would be my main connector for all of them. And the coupling that I used was actually so that way this Worbla would have something to grip onto and that they wouldn't just slide out if it was just a pipe. Now, I wouldn't normally recommend this method as it's not going to be as strong as using pipes to connect each of those pieces. However, I'm going to be covering this whole joint area in more expanding foam, and this was actually going to be what holds that main part of the body together. But before I did that step, I actually ended making our elbow joints first with the same process of expanding foam, waited for them to dry, and then I ended up gluing them to the male adapter parts of the harness so that way it was in the actual shape that I wanted. And then afterwards I did that process of the expanding foam to connect the last of the joints, and then just repeated all the same steps. And I'll note that this type of wing is a lot lighter than doing EVA foam wings, so keep that in mind. Just not with the spikes at the bottom. The spikes made the wings heavy, but otherwise they were super lightweight and really easy to wear without the spikes. And speaking about spikes, let's paint them now. And here's all of the materials that I used for painting them, including, yes, paprika, and we'll get to that in a bit. And we'll start off with my main source of reference image, which actually was for the life-size statue of Lilith that Blizzard has. And these are some pictures that I found from the actual workshop of them making the statue. So my main reference was actually the statue, and I tried to mimic the same kind of painting technique that they had on the spikes for this. And I first started off by priming the piece with 3 heavy coats of Plastia, followed by using airbrush paint, and then started to paint using airbrush paint that was provided by Createx Colors, as well as airbrush gun and compressor provided by Iwata Eclipse, so thank you. And the paint job was actually pretty easy. I did a base coat of Wicked Brown onto the entire piece, and then a mixture of jet black and brown at the top, and then using Pyro Red at the tip, doing a light fade upward. For shading, I like to do my typical technique where I apply in small sections the jet black, and then while it was still wet, got a paper towel and wiped it away. This would leave all of the surface, the color that was underneath, and all of the deeper crevices where your paper towel doesn't reach will leave it darker and more black. So you get natural shading with these pieces. But I felt the tip was a little too dark, and I used another technique where you actually get airbrush cleaner, apply a little bit onto your paper towel, and while it's still wet, you actually just kind of rub and buff the section that you want the last top layer of paint to remove. And this actually will clean up some of the black and leave the undercolor of the red more exposed. Do be aware, if you do too much, you will actually rub and buff more layers down, so be light with this. Now for paprika. And for this is kind of the technique that I used throughout the Lilith costume onto anything that I wanted to look more rusty, more dirt-like. So I used it onto the spikes of the wings, all of the horns, and the horn set that she wears. And this is where you do a mixture of paprika, brown airbrush paint, as well as a little bit of water, and you want it to be a little bit more chunky, and just apply it into all of the dips and the channels, anywhere where there's depthness, and this will kind of be a seat for the paprika to stay and look like a natural kind of dirt or rust onto the surface. And the most important step if you're going to use the paprika method is actually to seal your pieces, and for this I'm going to be using Createx Colors UV UVLS satin. And this is the sealer. Just apply an even coat onto all of the pieces, and this will help hold the paprika on the surface and not come off. And I'll say I'm really happy with the end results of these. I think I got really close to the references that I wanted, so yay! And then on to painting the body. And most of the paint materials are going to be the same with a little bit of different paint lines and colors. And the main reference that I did for this was actually the back image of the life-size Lilith statue, and basically where the base of the wings attaches to your back, it's more of a white skin color look. So I kind of wanted it to match my own skin color, and then it fades into a darker colored brown and then goes up, and I really wanted this to feel more animalistic and more like skin with my paint job. And as always, you had to prime the piece first, so 3 coats of Plasti Dip, knock that out of the way, and then on to painting. And the base coat I'm gonna be using for this is, again, the Wicked Brown, followed by a mixture of Wicked Brown and Green. And I applied this color heavily towards where it was going to attach on my back, and then kind of added it in some highlighted areas. And the paint job is going to look funky right now, but it's going to change in a bit because we're going to be doing a wash on top of this. So that means this color that we're going to be mixing, which is actually going to be a watered down version using the Candyline paint, specifically their orange and brown. And then I'm just going to apply it onto the surface, and while it's still wet, wipe it away with a paper towel. And that's going to cause the undercolors to come through, as well as this to kind of look like actual skin where you can see your veins underneath. So if you wanted to go in and add a little bit more color before this, do so, and then put this on top. It's going to really look like monster skin. And I felt like where it attaches to my back, the lighter part, it didn't feel as skin colory lightness to me. It got a little too dark. So I wanted to go back with a dry paintbrush and do a dry brush of paint on top using cream. And this is where you put a tiny bit on the paintbrush, and then you just kind of scratch the surface, and it's not going to go into the deep parts. It's only going to hit the highlighted areas. And I kind of just feathered this towards the elbows, but mainly applied it heavily where it was going to attach on my back. The last parts that we're going to be painting are actually the horns. You have the upside down elf-shaped horns, as well as the 2 little spikes that come out. And for these, I'm going to be painting them with a paintbrush, and I'm going to be using Candyline again, specifically the Dirt Track color. And this is going to be, when you apply it heavily, it actually dries darker, but be careful, it'll drip, or it's very liquidy. And when you apply it lighter, it's going to actually be more transparent when it dries. And then I did a mixture of the Dirt Track brown and the black color of Candy, and I kind of just faded it, starting heavily at the tips and then kind of feathering it downwards, so it gave this nice natural gradient. And then I did our final little technique of using the paprika to cause the more rust dirt-like look onto the 2 horn spike pieces, and finished by sealing with more of our Createx Colors UVLS matte. And if you haven't seen the wings, they are a bit large, and there's spikes that go down on the bottom of them. But I had to do a lot of engineering because I have to fly with these, and so I had to make it so they weren't one giant piece. So each pair of wings has a main body piece, and then there are 4 individual spikes that attach to the bottom of each of them. Now, when I'm in costume, I can't assemble the wings, and you're not gonna walk all day having some handler hold the wings for you. It's just not gonna happen. So I wanted to make it easy that if anybody was around, they could assemble the wings. So for that, I actually did at the bottom of each of these, I color coordinated them. So I did rainbow colors that would correlate to the spike that would go with it. And this is one of the spikes, and each one has a specific color that matches to the bottom piece, so I can easily identify which one it goes to. And a little extra step that was not actually painting was attaching the top spike. And originally I was designing this part so it would come on and off with Velcro as box limitations for flying. However, I ended up deciding, well, it's gonna be an oversized box because there's no way around it, so I wanted to just permanently attach it. And I used a mixture of contact cement glue and hot glue, but it kinda worked, kinda didn't. permanent just because it needs to be permanently attached. So I would recommend, instead of doing this after, attaching this piece at the very beginning when you're making this, so that way it's permanently attached and it doesn't slightly come off. And here's what the wings look like so far. I'm actually really happy with how it came in. I will say though, at BlizzCon, because everything was so dark there, they actually ended up looking a little bit more muddy, so you don't see as much of the colors and the subtle fades as if you were outside. So something to be aware of: if you're going to be in a dark place, you may not want to add as much shading, as the whole Lilith costume is very brown, so you may want to lighten it up so it pops more. But I think I got pretty close to the life-size statue as my reference image for it. The very last thing that we're going to talk about for making these wings is the webbing, and this was a whole new thing for me. So there was a lot of trial and error, but I actually really like how they look in the end. And here's everything that I used for the webbing. And the main reference image from Lilith was the statue again, and I like it, but they feel so hard. And for me, wings, especially hers, are more supposed to be like bat wings and be transparent. And that's what I tried to go for. And for me, I wanted to do the wings so they looked more like bat wings and be transparent. And the material I found that I was doing tons of research for was actually latex, as this was the closest thing to skin. And I felt like for other materials, if I used EVA foam for the wing webbing, it's gonna look solid. It's not gonna give me that transparency. Even if you use transparent foam, it just won't look right. And same with fabric and using cheesecloth, because that's another method you could have done. It looks similar, but then it looks like fabric wings. And I wanted these to look as real as possible as bat wings. So that's how I ended up with latex. And it took a lot of research to find this material, fabric sheeting. And I had this whole idea of doing it one way and making it in layers and gluing it together, and it all went to shit and it was terrible and it didn't work. So I went to another method using the latex, and that way did work though. And I first traced the shapes of the wing webbing from my blueprint. However, I found that in my final version of the wings, the span of each of the wings between each other were slightly different. So I ended up getting some tracing paper and tracing the section of the wing, that empty gap, and that's what I used for my pattern, and then traced that on to the latex. Another issue that I kind of came across though was with painting these wings, you need it to be where it is put on something. You can't just hold it or hang it up, as you're basically painting fabric, really lightweight, and it's just gonna blow. So you do have to tape these down. So I would recommend making these wing cutouts a little bit larger than what you want, and then I just used masking tape and taped them onto cardboard. I'll note that masking tape will remove the paint from the surface of the latex. So if you are putting them down on one way and you're only going to paint on one side, make sure you mirror them. But I wanted to paint on both sides, so I found this out the hard way, as the tape did remove a little bit of my paint, so there was a little bit of cracking that wasn't intentional. And the wings from the reference image actually have where there are holes cut out. And after doing a lot of samples, I found that this actually, from cutting the latex, made it look really bad. So instead of cutting out holes in each of these pieces, I actually ended up using my Cricut machine and some sticker paper and cutting out with the sticker paper the shape of the holes, and then I would stick them onto the latex. And this would basically block off where the paint would be sprayed there, and when you remove it, there wouldn't be any paint underneath it, which would give you a hole-like look onto the wings. Now for painting them, I also ran into a ton of problems, as all types of paint did not want to stick to the surface of the latex. Not to mention, make sure to fully clean your latex off, because typically when you get it, it has a kind of baby powder dust on top of it, so you want to make sure that's fully removed so that way paint would adhere to it. But because this latex sheeting is a 4-way stretch and it's it's like a super stretch, paint will chip off, including latex paint, and that is an issue. So I did a bunch of different tests, and the paint line that I actually came across that worked best was Createx Colors Illustration Paint, specifically more of their Bloodline. And for this paint, I did a mixture of DK as well as the paint Espresso to get my color. And I basically just did a very light spray to kind of give me my idea of the shape that I wanted for these wings. I wanted the sides to be darker. I wanted the webbing to kind of connect slowly and to go around the holes. So after I kind of had that base down, I went back heavier. And I'll say I did more of an art version and kind of went a little bit more towards butterfly wings, and I think they're really pretty, but I'd say they aren't 100% to what Lilith's wings look like, but I don't care. I like them. They're my wings, and this is how I did them. Then I just removed them from the boxes, and technically I flipped them all over and painted the backside, and that's how I learned about masking tape and ripping up the paint. But once that was done, I was able to remove all of the sticker paper for the whole sections, and these are kind of what it looked like in the end. Now for attaching them, I basically got an X-Acto knife and just slitted where I wanted these pieces to go on the inside in a straight line. And then I got some tweezers, and then I just kind of shoved the latex into the slat. Now I will say that the paint job was beautiful for this webbing, and then when I tucked it into these slats, the edges all disappeared. So I ended up having to hand paint a lot of the edges inward more so it would show. So something to be aware of. You may want to know that there's going to be like at least an inch of your material that's going to be shoved into these things, so to make your darker color closer towards the inside. But that was the kind of main thing. And for attaching them, I just used some basic super glue. I will note that I am happy that this latex actually stretches. Each of the tentacles, kind of with the weight of them, made each of these pieces move back and forth. It looked very creepy when I walked, but it made it so everything kind of moved a little bit. So something to be aware of, there will be some bend back and forth. Also, with the super glue, when it dries, it does dry a little bit shiny and is noticeable. So I ended up going back by hand and painting over it with a paintbrush, and then you didn't see it. But that's basically how I did the webbing. I still like them. It's close to the reference, but not 100%, so it's my interpretation of it, but I'm still happy with it. Kind of helped for answering your questions on how I made my wings, and more specifically what you should and shouldn't do for your pair of wings. Yeah. And if you found this video helpful at all, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear back from you. Also, if you're interested in a specific wing harness, let me know. If I get enough people that are interested, then maybe I'll make it available on my website for you and to help you out with more wings. But thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. A big thank you to all of my company sponsors, as well as all of my members here on YouTube. I really appreciate your support, as this is my main source of income and how I pay my bills. So I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you on our next cosplay tutorial. Much love, guys.